All right, hey everyone. Time for the third video of this module in which we'll be thinking again about the powers of the president. So perhaps the most important set of powers that we need to think about in our discussion today are the president's inherent powers. And so these are powers that the president has essentially interpreted over time. I think we talked in the first video about this idea that regardless of your presidential style, you're going to be much more active in interpreting some of these powers in 2020 than you would be in 1800. And certainly that is, evident most of the time in these inherent powers. And so, for example, George Washington, in the very first presidency, even a withdrawn president, actually made an assumption that the Constitution gives him the ability to have what's called executive privilege, which is privacy in communications. And so executive privilege has been used by various presidents to help, essentially protect state secrets and to allow the president to maneuver, even though they're an incredibly public-facing figure. So that's something that presidents, again, this is not expressly in the Constitution, but presidents have interpreted it to be essentially part of their powers as presidents. That's why it's called an inherent power. They essentially say, because I am the president, I think I have the power to do this, and then they kind of wait to see if anybody will stop them. And so, for example, Lincoln exercised the inherent power of the presidency to protect the nation during times of emergency, right, during the Civil War. Certainly, this was an incredibly politically controversial kind of thing, and many critics argued that he was trampling the Constitution at the time. And of course, we can think, in the 20th century about Truman, who reinterprets his power and says, hey, I'm the commander-in-chief. I think I'm able to declare war unilaterally. And Congress says, no, the Constitution does not say that, right? That's our job too, right? And there's a back and forth that ends up in the War Powers Resolution and successive presidents even ignoring that War Powers Resolution. I encourage you, if you're interested in that sort of chapter, take a look at the textbook and read a little bit more about the War Powers Resolution, why Congress was so upset about this idea, and why successive presidents have essentially skirted that War Powers Resolution. Even now. I'll give you a hint there, though. It's the idea that this is a resolution and not a law. Therefore, it is not binding. It's not a constitutional amendment either. And so the presidents are certainly able to think about it and look at it and listen to it, but they are not compelled, essentially, to act one way or the other. They, again, have basically interpreted inherent powers, and Congress, in many respects, has not stopped them in a significant way. And so I guess really this whole discussion, going all the way back to the very first things that we were talking about, the president's enumerated powers in the Constitution, the idea that the president is able to now have a lot more power over the details of legislation through the delegated power, and now the idea that there's these inherent powers, including but not limited to the executive order, right, which is, again, an instruction to the bureaucracy to start doing something different, right? The question is, can presidents do whatever they want? And I think, I guess at this point, it's actually very important to take a little break to talk about this idea of an executive order. I think in a previous video, we were talking about the idea that a rule that's created by a bureaucracy is not the same as a law. The law provides the overarching framework for the way that these details of policy should be implemented on the ground. The bureaucracies are then able to fill in the details that gives them some leeway and power. An executive order is exactly that. It's not changing the law. An executive order, I'm sure you've all seen this, right, where Trump holds up this big piece of paper with his big signature on it, right? That executive order is not a law. It's not something that Congress has passed at all. What it is essentially is it is a statement to bureaucracies to reinterpret legislation, to reinterpret some of the things that they're doing, to change their behavior. And so again, one of the questions of executive orders is, are they legal, right? Do they skirt some of the existing law? Or are they constitutional as well? Do they fall victim to some of the problems with constitutionality that might also apply to laws? I think we saw, early in the Trump presidency, the travel bans, so-called, in many places they were called Muslim bans, and that was actually used in court in many cases. I think Trump himself tweeted that he was calling this a Muslim ban, and as a result, it actually helped the case to essentially dismiss the executive orders. And so if we think about this, right, this idea that presidents, through executive orders, through signing statements, through delegated powers, through their inherent powers, it seems like presidents are sort of infinitely powerful, right? Well, there's some checks as well on the powers of the president that we want to think about. Impeachment, of course, has a fuzzy definition, and we've seen that it's very, very difficult for a removal of office to actually happen unless you have a very unified government with a very large proportion of sort of partisans that dislike the president on both the House and the Senate. Otherwise, we'll see an acquittal, essentially, as we saw in Trump's impeachment proceedings. But also, we have this idea that presidents need to do things that their political party likes. Again, because going exactly back to that earlier point, that you don't want to anger your own party too much, because again, these political actors in Congress and members of political parties also have their own political careers to think about, and they might get mad and they might yell at you. So of course, you don't want to essentially piss off your own political party in Congress. But I think the thing to really focus in on, or at least what the literature says we should focus on, is this idea that the president's kryptonite is the public. This idea that presidents are sensitive to the public. And, this is a really important point, even in a Trump presidency where we might say to ourselves, well, Trump doesn't care at all about public opinion. He's going to do whatever he wants. That's actually still not true, right? Presidents are very sensitive to public opinion. They try to do things that are popular as much as they can. And in many cases, right, part of the reason why the president is so sensitive to public opinion is that the president is always concerned about their legacy. And so the president, in addition to thinking about what the public wants, is also trying to pass laws and to engage in sort of legislative successes by partnering with Congress in order to, have history look back upon them and say, oh, this was a successful president that was able to actually get things done. Presidents that didn't get anything done are generally looked upon by sort of the historical record as being, ineffective and weak. And presidents don't like that, right? They want to go down in history as good presidents. And that's, I think, a very important motivation, sort of psychologically, for presidents. And so the president, of course, needs to partner with congressional party leaders. Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell obviously are working very closely together to do things like nominate Supreme Court justices. But it's very hard to do this during periods of divided government. So the president, in this case, needs to be very careful of public opinion, especially because passing laws are so difficult, and the executive agenda, that is the sort of list of wish list items that the president wants to accomplish in their 4 years in office, often that starts to fall by the wayside. As whichever chamber of Congress, in this case, right, during this session, it's the House of Representatives, essentially makes it so that Republican legislation has a very, very hard time passing through both houses of Congress. And so I think the other thing to really think about is this idea that the president also needs to really stay on message. And this gets us into some discussions that go kind of beyond what we've been talking about so far in the course of these institutions, to something that's a little bit more in the wheelhouse of media and communication studies, or of media and politics studies. This is the idea that the president is operating in this incredibly convoluted, incredibly saturated media environment. And so, essentially all administrations are trying as much as possible to provide a message to the American public that is going to resonate, that's going to maybe influence Congress, and that's maybe also going to influence citizens. Because, of course, one of the foremost goals of any presidential administration, at least in their first term, is to get reelected. And so we're trying to yield, popular legislation, trying to get people on our side, trying essentially to be viewed favorably by history. This is a very difficult task, actually, for presidents. And it's one reason why so many presidents, and sort of, again, going back to that first discussion of presidential character, why they view their role so differently, right? Some presidents see these challenges of trying to stay on message, trying to win over the public and win over Congress and get things passed, as being incredibly pressuring. And others see it as a challenge to sort of find ways to devise new loopholes to get things through and to persuade enemies and allies. It really, I think, is one of the reasons why we can't forget this idea that presidential character is just so important, and why it's crucially important to have a president who is interested in some of these things, right? With staying on message, with appealing to a broad swath of the American electorate, with cooperating with Congress. All of these kind of important, goals of of any president, I think, speak to the idea that presidential quality is incredibly important. And you really want somebody in there who's able to navigate this very difficult political environment, but also not push too hard and essentially break some of the foundational pillars of the constitutional order. So again, with all these things having been said, I think one of the foundational takeaways that we can leave this discussion in Module 7 with is the idea that the president in modern times is incredibly powerful and continues to interpret new ways to be more and more powerful. Nevertheless, there are important checks on the president, but not all of them are institutional. Some of them have to do with the behavior and opinions of ordinary American citizens. I hope that you have a wonderful week, and I very much look forward to talking about this with you during our discussion period. And yeah, have a good one. Think carefully about presidents and the presidency as an institution. And I wish you all the best as you prepare for the next module. So long, everyone.